In episode 1, I introduced the concept of profane musicianship. And in the preview for this episode, I suggested that technical mastery is often the sound of fear. That precision and speed are frequently built not out of love for the music, but out of the need to prove worth in a culture that withholds it. I also suggested that performative emotion, the visible display of feeling, often serves the same purpose, protecting us from being truly seen. This episode takes that claim further. It looks at where this fear comes from and how it shapes the way we play and what it costs us over time. It also begins to ask what becomes possible when we stop performing for validation and start working with the instrument in a different way. As in this last episode, we'll move between two streams. One that looks at the external pressures of performance culture, and another that looks at inner transformation. Both point toward the same possibility, recovering a more direct and less defensive relationship with music. So I'm going to start with self as performance. In the last episode, we looked at how performance culture splits musical playing into two dominant modes. One mechanically flat and overly controlled, and the other exaggerated and inauthentic in its emotional display. Both turn music into a form of self-presentation. What I'm calling profane musicianship is an attempt to step outside of that split. But there's a deeper layer underneath both of those modes, and it has to do with the self that's doing the performing. This self, the everyday self we usually identify with when we play, is not as natural or personal as it feels. Whether it shows up as confident or insecure, humble or arrogant, it is still the self. And this self is ultimately unreal. It is something that has been shaped, even programmed by the culture we live in. It constantly needs validation from teachers, audiences, recordings, algorithms, or even from our own future self in order to feel like it exists. This is close to what Byung-Chul Han describes as the achievement subject, a version of the self that is constantly subjected to the demand to perform and prove its value. It is not free, it is self-subjugating. The internalization of the society itself. One of the clearest places this shows up is in speed. The faster we play, the more attention we often feel we'll receive. Speed becomes a way of earning validation, feeding the self with recognition so it can temporarily feel like it has worth. It creates the sensation of importance and progress, even when very little of substance may actually be happening in the music. This self, whether we experience it as driven or anxious, is not something we choose. It is something we inherited. And as long as we remain identified with it, we will keep performing for others, for culture, and for the version of ourselves that never feels worthy. So now I'm going to move on to culture as a machine. So this self doesn't arise in a vacuum. It is produced and maintained by the culture we live in. Modern culture, and especially the digital and platform culture that now dominates it, does not simply damage self-worth. It is organized around the absence of it. From early on, we are taught that our value is not given, but must be earned. Worth becomes something we have to achieve, display, and constantly renew through performance. So this is not primarily the fault of an individual teacher, parents, or institutions. Those figures are themselves operating inside the same system. And so they often reinforce the message that we are not enough as we are. But they are not the original source of the message. The system itself requires people to feel insufficient so that they will keep striving, competing, and performing for validation. In this environment, the self learns to treat its own activity, whether technical skill, emotional expression, or visible productivity, as currency. The more we can show, the more validation we receive. And because the underlying sense of lack is never truly resolved, the demand to perform never really ends. This is why simply trying to build more confidence or self-esteem often fails. The problem is not just inside the individual. It is structural. The culture produces the wound and then offers performance as the only available medicine. That leads to technique as armor. Technical mastery is often treated as an unquestioned good. The more precise, controlled, and impressive the playing, the higher its value is assumed to be. But when we look closely, much of what gets called technical mastery functions as a form of self-protection. Precision and control can become ways of hiding. The cleaner and more polished the execution, the less space remains for uncertainty, raw sound, or anything that might reveal the player behind the performance. In this way, technique often operates less as a means of expression and more as a defense against feeling vulnerable or inadequate. So this defensive use of skill shows up in the constant technical display that fills nearly every musical moment. Rather than allowing space, silence, or even moments of simplicity, the playing stays busy, layering technique over every gesture as if stillness or restraint would risk too much exposure. When technique is used primarily as armor, which is what I'm referring to here, the music tends to become something to be displayed rather than something lived. The player remains hidden behind the performance, even when the playing appears highly skilled or emotionally charged. So speed becomes an escape. So speed is often treated as a sign of vitality and progress in music. The faster the execution, the more impressive and alive the playing is assumed to be. But speed frequently serves another purpose. It becomes a way of escaping something uncomfortable. When playing becomes very fast, there is less time for reflection, hesitation, or silence. The music keeps moving forward so quickly that there is little space to feel what is actually happening in the moment. In this way, speed can function as a form of avoidance, a way of outrunning the sense that nothing substantial is being said, or that the player has nothing real to offer beyond the technical display. This is especially true when speed is driven by the need for validation. The faster we play, the more attention we often feel we'll receive. Speed becomes a strategy for earning recognition, feeding the self with enough external approval to temporarily quiet its underlying sense of worthlessness. It creates the illusion of momentum and importance, even when the playing may be largely empty underneath. Over time, this pattern becomes exhausting. The self keeps accelerating in the hope of finally feeling worthy. But the validation never lasts. The result is a kind of internal burnout, constant motion with no real arrival. So, performative emotion can become a masquerade. Emotion in music is often treated as a sign of depth and authenticity. The more visibly moved the player is, or appears to be, the more the performance is assumed to carry real feeling. But much of what gets presented as emotion is actually a form of masquerade, feeling that has been shaped and performed in order to be seen and approved. There is a difference between emotion that arises naturally and emotion that is staged to produce a particular effect. When feeling becomes something shaped for approval rather than something genuinely experienced, it stops functioning as real expression and starts functioning as another form of self-protection. The player remains hidden behind the appearance of feeling. This distinction requires a certain maturity, a heart and a mind that are integrated enough to tell the difference between what is truly moving through them and what is being performed for validation. Without that integration, it becomes very easy to mistake the performance of emotion for the real thing. So when emotion is used primarily as masquerade, the music tends to become something offered up for attention rather than something transmitted through presence. The player may appear deeply moved, but the actual transmission remains blocked by the need to be seen feeling. This leads to the wound maker selling the medicine. So what do I mean by that? The wound maker sells the medicine. The culture that produces this sense of unworthiness is the very system we are then encouraged to seek worth from. We are taught to feel insufficient from the start, and performance, technical skill, emotional display, visible achievement is presented as the way to earn that worth back. This creates a closed loop. The more we perform in the hope of finally feeling worthy, the more we remain dependent on the system that created the sense of unworthiness in the first place. The wound is not healed by the performance. It is only temporarily soothed by it. And because the underlying lack is never resolved, the demand to perform continues. In this way, the system does not need to force anyone into constant self-display. It only needs to maintain the condition in which performance feels like the only available path to value. The fear of being worthless keeps the cycle running, and the performance itself becomes the medicine that never cures the condition it claims to treat. So, taking the mask off, Nigredo and the powers of the Sphinx. I'm going to talk about this as an alternative, as a way out of this mess. When we begin to stop performing for worth, or even to question it, something starts to shift. The strategies that once felt necessary, technical control, speed, staged emotion, begin to lose their grip. The shift often begins with a kind of inner discomfort or darkness. In alchemy, this stage is called Nigredo, the blackening. It is the point where the old form starts to break down. It is rarely comfortable, and it is not something that can be bypassed if anything more real is to emerge. And let me talk about that a little bit. So the stages of alchemy, Nigredo, which corresponds to the new moon or midnight. It represents total darkness, the absence of light, and the chaotic prima materia before illumination begins. This whole cycle is known as the magnum opus, or the great work, which is the whole point of life in alchemical philosophy. So we have Nigredo, which is the start, and albedo is whitening, and this corresponds to the full moon. It reflects pure, cool lunar light, symbolizing clarity and purification that is still reflective, borrowed light, rather than self-generated. And then citrinitas, which is yellowing, corresponds to the dawn or sunrise. This is the critical transition where lunar reflection fades and the first solar rays appear. So it marks the shift from passive understanding to active, warming wisdom. And finally, rubedo, which is reddening. And this corresponds to the noon sun, or the zenith. It represents the full intensity of solar fire, where light and heat are fully integrated, symbolizing the completion of the work and the embodiment of the solar self. And it's really the self-generated wisdom in its active form at that point. Okay, so back to taking the mask off. So the Nigredo phase is also where the four magical virtues become practical. I spoke about those at the end of episode 1. And these powers, to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent have long been regarded as essential inner work. They are sometimes referred to as the powers of the Sphinx because they represent the balanced development of the self. To know what is actually happening beneath the performance, to will something more authentic than approval, to dare to stop doing what no longer serves, and especially to keep silent, to stop filling every space with sound or technical display simply to be seen. These four powers were traditionally understood as preparation. They develop the conditions in which something beyond the programmed self can begin to move. In older traditions, this preparatory work was seen as leading toward a deeper stage, often symbolized by the Grail. The Grail stands here not as a literal object, but as an image of what becomes possible once the need to perform has loosened its hold, a different relationship to music and to oneself, no longer driven by the demand for worth or recognition. It points towards something that cannot be fully grasped. It cannot be grasped by the rational mind, not entirely. This is not a final state to be reached, but an ongoing process. So what gets disrupted? When the mask begins to come off, the old system of fear and performance loses some of its power. The strategies that once felt necessary, constant technical display, speed, staged emotion, no longer feel as compelling or as safe as they once did. This shift can feel destabilizing at first. So it's destabilizing at first. And so the self that was built around performing for worth begins to lose its footing. And with it goes some of the certainty and momentum that performance once provided. There can be a period of uncertainty, even a kind of emptiness, as the old ways of moving through music start to fall away. At the same time, something else becomes possible. Something is being born. When the need to impress or protect begins to loosen, space opens up. The music can start to feel less like something that must be controlled or displayed, and more like a transmission rather than a performance. What was once defended territory can begin to grow into something more alive and less guarded. In closing, I want to point out that precision is often not the sound of mastery. It's the sound of someone trying to prove they're not worthless. When we begin to see this clearly, the strategies we have relied on, technical control, speed, and performed emotion, start to lose their necessity. What was once defended can begin to open. This doesn't mean rejecting skill or technique. It means no longer using them primarily as an end in themselves. The work is not to become more impressive, but to become capable of being present without the constant need for external approval, and instead to discover and begin tapping into an inner wellspring of value from within. So in the next episode, we'll look more closely at what becomes possible when that need to begin falls away, and what it means to approach the instrument not as a stage, but as something closer to a vessel. So once again, if this resonated with you, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for listening.